Hello, everyone, and hello, Hari Prasad.
Hi.
This is Michael Sloyer, and this is Upbuilding the Self. And Hari, we are here to talk about a piece that you recently wrote called The Two Sides of Working on Yourself. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this piece because this is a real cornerstone piece for Upbuild. It articulates our work in such a beautiful way. I know it's been such a service to me reading that piece. And again, rereading it today, it's been a service to our community members, including my dad, who is not easily swayed on matters like this. So really excited to talk to you about this today.
Wow, I'm really honored to hear all of that and about your dad as well. That's amazing. Thank you. I'm excited. I mean, I love the subject matter, so I can't wait.
Beautiful. So could you get us started by sharing your inspiration for writing this piece?
Yeah. So subtly, there have been always two aspects to our self-work. And I was looking for a way to really crystallize and codify our approach to working on ourselves at Upbuild. And one day in our Remembering Who We Are weekly gathering, we had an inspiration around this where it became very, very clear to me that there's investing in the ego and investing in the self. And this is not something that's foreign to me. This is something which I had been doing and which had been clear all along, but it just came much sharper into focus. And I was so struck by it that it was almost as if it was a fresh aha. You know, when something that you're working with then suddenly snaps into focus, it's very powerful. So I thought, okay, I have to write this down and I have to share this because, as you said, this is so central to our work. This is really what it's all about. This is like, you can't get more dead center than this. So that was my inspiration.
Amazing. Amazing. So let's start with some definitions. You said the two sides of working on yourself. One is the ego and one is the self. What is the ego and what is the self?
Yeah. So we define the ego at Upbuild as the identity of who we think we should be. The identity of who we think we should be. So we're all trying to project something. We're all trying to prove something to ourselves. And we want the world to see us in that way so that then we feel we're enough. And that is the game that runs our lives. And we can never get out of that because the ego governs us. It governs us and it's not us. So the self is who we actually are. It's what's beneath that governing ego that covers us. It is the spiritual core that many of us, I would say actually all of us, have some intuition about, whether we are really warmed up to that intuition or whether that feels foreign, uncomfortable, undesirable. We all have some sense that there's a deeper me and a core that is transcendent of our worldly experience. So that is the self.
Yeah. I really appreciate that word intuition and this deeper sense of me. Even for people who don't have any sort of spiritual leanings or spiritual inclinations, which I would consider myself hardcore one of those people 10 to 15 years ago, there still was that deeper sense. And that's such a great entry point into being hungry for more understanding of what's going on.
Well, I can echo that because 16 years ago, I was also such a person. And it was really unattractive to me to speak about spirituality. It was something that I had zero interest in and was actually repelled by. So I am with you on that. And obviously, there have been a lot of shifts. And there's also interestingly, some shifting in the landscape of our world to the point where, usually in organizations, you can't speak about spirituality. But one organization that we've done a lot of work with over the years actually has a spiritual component to their work that they offer to other companies. And they call it the spiritual side of things. So that speaks again to the intuition that we all have, that there's something. Now, we may not be speaking about the same thing. One person may have one conception of what is spiritual and another, and one may be more threatening, one may be less threatening. But there's this sense of, yeah, you know what? We all have a soul. We even use that as a figure of speech, that, this is coming from my soul, whether I believe in a soul or not, from the depths of my soul, from my heart and soul.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to get into the soul a little later, but we can start with the ego. Because as you write in your piece, working on the ego just feels a little bit more natural to people, especially right off the bat as they're starting their self-work. So what's important about working on the ego, and how do we even get started doing that?
Yeah, what's important about working on the ego is that, as I always say, if we want to be our best self, we have to see what's getting in the way. And what's getting in the way is only one thing, nothing else. Nothing else. It's just the ego. It's this conception of who I think I should be. And I'm seeing everything through that lens. And all the obstacles that I face are because I'm so identified and so attached to this sense of self that is the opposite of transcendent, that is really, really limited and limiting, full of self-limiting beliefs and full of criticism, self-criticism. The inner critic that we all have is the mouthpiece of the ego. So it's constantly telling us, you're not enough, you have to do more, do this, do that. And making us feel crappy and making us feel like we need to blame other people because, hey, it shouldn't be my fault. If I can offload the responsibility to others, then maybe my inner critic will leave me alone. But it's all coming from the suffering that my ego creates. And the inner critic is the way that we often feel that suffering internally.
Yeah. Okay. And I want to just one point of clarification, because in our everyday vernacular, when somebody says, oh, that person has a huge ego, they're usually talking about arrogance rather than saying that person has a strong inner critic. So can you help shed some light on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, see, we all have an ego, right? We all have this sense of self that is not aligned with the deepest me. And the more we feed that and the more we buy into it, the bigger the ego feels. The inner critic is calling the shots in terms of getting me to adhere and obey my ego. It's giving me the dictates. And so again, we all have that, but we feed the ego to varying degrees. And so our inner critic can be louder and more intense or softer. Now, an important aspect to this is what may look like poor self-confidence, which, I mean, it's also a fact, but it can look like very little ego, is actually the flip side of the same coin. So the inner critic can be really rough on me, and other people may think, oh, this person has very little ego because look at how little self-confidence they have. Whereas when we typically think about big egos, we're thinking about people that are like showing bravado and just so much self-confidence. But that's not actually the case. See, the inferiority complex is just the superiority complex negated. It's just the flip side of the same coin. I'm telling myself I should be enough. I should be better. I should be so good. I want to be great. And I'm not. Oh, woe is me. Oh my God. And I have it too. So it's not to demean, but we do have to poke fun at ourselves and see that what we think is just an innocent, low self-confidence, sometimes even masquerades as humility, is actually something else. And we want to be really living in the truth of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great framing, with inferiority complex and superiority complex being two sides of the same coin. And similarly, on the superiority complex side, when we see someone being very overt in self-promotion and pounding their chest, that really is an inferior complex showing up in the opposite kinds of behaviors.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to prove it if you really felt it. You wouldn't have to prove it. So all of these big shows of ego are because I don't feel enough, and I'm constantly chasing after my own self-worth, and often the validation for that self-worth from others.
Yeah. Okay. So how can we work on our egos?
First, we have to see them. We don't see our egos, then we have nothing to work with. So that is really a big, big piece of this puzzle. It's self-awareness. And we've done a podcast. I think it might be our first one. If you think you're self-aware, you're not. And the thing is, we take self-awareness pretty cheaply. Like, it's so common, and we talk about it in the podcast, it's so common to be like, I think I'm a pretty self-aware person. There's so much more to it. There's so much that we're not seeing. We have to get really curious. What am I not seeing? How do I see the subtle layers of ego? And it's a universe. It's a universe that demands deep exploration and commitment. So then when we start to see things, we know what we need to work on. So, and that leads to 4 steps that I gave in the piece, which I find to be extremely beneficial and really want to offer to everybody. So again, once you're seeing things, then you have something to work with. So step 1 is call yourself out. When you're seeing your ego, oh, I need claps. I did, I washed the dishes and my wife didn't see it. I need her to clap my hands for me because I'm feeling really bad about myself. That's something which I do, and I have to call myself out for. Right? It's ridiculous. We have to poke fun at ourselves again, but calling ourselves out is honest, and it's a way of taking responsibility, which we'll speak about in a minute. So call ourselves out for the ways that our ego is showing up. It's showing up all the time. We just have to have the courage and the diligence to really see it. Then the second step is trying not to play into it. So I try to be better about not being frustrated when my wife doesn't see that I wash the dishes or clean the bathroom. That's an example I often use because I have an identity around being the bathroom cleaner in our home. And, that's my big contribution, and it's a dirty job. Somebody's got to do it. So I'll take the hit, and it's really helpful to just not play into it and to laugh at myself before something comes out, before I catch myself getting frustrated or trying to show my wife, look at what my value is. Look at what I did for you. Aren't I so good? So try not to play into it as a second step. The third is inevitably we will play into our egos at times. The better we get at working on our egos, the less frequent and the less severe. But even then, it happens, and we have to create allowance and forgiveness for ourselves, compassion. That's critical. So take responsibility for when your ego does show up in a way that is causing difficulty for yourself or for others or both. And when it's not causing difficulty, we have to again ask, what am I missing? Because my ego is always a blocker to the truth, to who I really am deep down and how I can be my best for others. So take responsibility, figure out what is the impact of what I'm doing, apologize, be humble, be honest, be real. This also ties to calling ourselves out, but really try to rein it in and try to get other people to see that you care about this work on yourself. So that's step 3, is taking responsibility when we do play into our egos. And the 4th is seeking guidance, getting help, because we cannot do this alone. If our egos are running the show, how are we going to get out of that? We need people to support us. We need people outside of ourselves, outside of our governing ego system, to help us. And we need to humble ourselves that much more, which is the antidote to the ego. The ego is the opposite of humility. So if we are humbling ourselves and seeking help and saying, you know what, I can't do this on my own. Can you please bear with me, support me? Then it's a very, very powerful approach. We need coaching. We need people also, especially who are further along on this path, that can provide their insights of their own self-work and their insights of us, and help us get to the next step, the next step, the next step.
Excellent. So we have 4 steps. Call yourself out. Don't play into it. When you inevitably do play into it, take responsibility for that, which includes figuring out the impact, possibly going back directly to the people who you've affected and apologizing or trying to make things right. And then getting help, seeking guidance. And what I've noticed from my own work, both on myself and with the clients that I work with, is that when people do get help, when they're at step 4, that person usually sends them to step 1. Or is there some inspiration through the help that they're getting to start being more active, calling themselves out? And then step 2, not playing into it. And step 3, taking responsibility for it. So it feels like this really nice repeating process. It's not like we can just go down the list and then we're done. Actually, step 4 sends us right back to 1, 2, and 3.
100%. That's great. That's great. Yeah. And we want to be careful also not to be stuck in one step. Like, it's easy to just make my project calling myself out and never doing anything about it. And then I get the validation that, look at how honest and humble and vulnerable I am and how self-aware I am. I'm always calling myself out. But are you putting your money where your mouth is? And are you doing it for the right reasons? Are you really working on the ego, or are you building a new identity out of it?
Well, I feel the need to call myself out for something right now, which I've never shared with you or anyone on our team, which is that so we have a question which we often use as a warm-up question for many of our workshops, especially our work with the Enneagram, which is, what is one embarrassing way that your ego shows up? And we've been asking this question for years now. And over the past, year or two, I've made this really long list of many different ways that my ego shows up. I think I'm over 100 now. And so I'm feeling slightly called out here because I don't know that I've done anything about those 100. I mean, it's super helpful to have written them down and feel like I've called myself out. But now I might need to go back through this list and actually figure out what are steps 2 and 3 in this process as well.
Wow, that's really something. Thank you so much for sharing that, Michael. Yeah, I had no idea. I really appreciate your spirit a lot. And also your vivid examples of how your ego is showing up in an embarrassing way are always um, some of my favorite things that I've heard. It's so good. So I look forward to seeing what more comes from this.
Well, actually, one of the things on that list is the glory that I've pictured myself receiving when I finally did tell you about this list.
Wow. This is full of unexpected surprises. Wonderful.
Good. Anything else that we should be aware of as we're thinking about working on the ego?
There's layer after layer to be peeled. It's a constant lifelong project to see how one layer of ego shields me from another, shields me from another, shields me from another. There's always more layers to the onion. And so much so that actually, if you're really serious about this, it must become discouraging. It must. If it's not discouraging, then we haven't yet done the real work. There's still much more to go because it can be, and it's meant to be intoxicating to start to see our egos and peeling off the layers and feeling freer, feeling like, wow, this is more in line with who I am. And I'm able to connect in such an authentic way with myself and with other people. It's meant to be so powerful. And we have that experience at our workshops a lot. This is a great starting point for our self-work, is working on our egos because it's so close to us. It's so tangible. It's so real. And we feel the effects of removing our masks, removing the coverings. But if we don't come to the point where we are sincerely, painfully discouraged, we haven't yet gotten to the real thing, because there's always another mask behind the mask. There's always another layer. And we talk about the ego in very stark, intense terms. It's the prison for the self. It's the prison. It's not something to be sugarcoated. And until we feel our imprisonment, there's not enough impetus to get the prisoner free. So we have to go there. And even in our work with the Enneagram, the personality typology that is very popular in our work, our teachers at the Enneagram Institute, Don Riso and Russ Hudson, would say that you cannot do this on your own, and you cannot do this without some work on the self, some spiritual practice, which will be, I think, a good segue. But you have to come to that point of helplessness, that I really can't do this, and the cost is too high to not free myself. So I become really so humble. Dare I say, I become like a beggar. And my mentor, Bhakti Tirtha Swami, who we speak about a lot in our programs, including Remembering Who We Are, he wrote a series of books called The Beggar about how to free ourselves from the ego by becoming so humble that we identify with needing help and seeking that help with such determination that we have the impetus to really get free. Now, this may not sound attractive, but that's because we're so identified with the ego.
Yeah, the ego does not like working on the ego.
Right. It doesn't like working on the ego, and it doesn't like feeling like a beggar. That's like the opposite of what it wants to be. But that's the only way to get to the other side. It's not that we all will start there by any means. We have to start with the excitement of peeling off the layers and feeling progress and feeling connection and feeling like, wow, this is great. And that's a lot of our work at Upbuild. But if we really want to walk this path, if we really want the fruits, the treasures of this work, we cannot stay there. We have to get to that point where we actually experience ourselves as beggars.
Super helpful. And I agree, that's a great transition now into the other way that we all need to work on ourselves. So we're working on the ego, we're peeling the layers, we're seeing more of who we are not. And yet, as you articulated earlier, we still have this sense that I'm something deeper than that. And actually, no amount of work on the ego alone is going to get us to that place. So take us into what's important about working on the soul.
Yeah, I gave the metaphor in the piece, the prison, and how removing the layers of ego is like removing the bars to the prison. And so it's exciting. I'm removing one bar after another. It feels miraculous. And then it's just that there's always another bar. There's always another bar. And until I actually invest in the self and grow my practices that awaken me to myself, I won't have the strength to break out. So, work on the self is going straight to the source of who I really am. It's investing in the me that requires awakening, that requires practices that build our strength of being. And that is not something which we're used to. It's not something which is comfortable for most of us. It is something which requires a different lens, a new paradigm. But that's what makes it even more exciting than working on the self. Working on the ego.
Yeah. And just one point of clarification. I use the word soul. You've been using the word self. How should our listeners understand that?
Well, they're one and the same. It's just that we have many different versions of ourself. And when we speak about the self proper, we're speaking about the real self, which is the soul.
Okay. Excellent.
The deepest me.
Yeah.
The deepest me. Yeah.
Deepest me. Yeah. What have you seen when people work on their egos a lot, but they never go to the soul or the self?
Yeah, you just stay within a certain comfort zone, and you will inevitably plateau. And you could be a likable person, you could have a decent life, but you'll never know what you're missing. You'll never know what that calling within is meant to offer you. And we all know that there is a calling deep within us. And now it's a buzzy thing to talk about our purpose. And that's aligned with this idea. C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud both talked about this using the same word. It's a German word, Sehnsucht. Sehnsucht. And what Sehnsucht means is this insatiable longing. It's a longing for something that I can't even quantify. I have no idea what to do with it. I have no idea what to make of it. I have no idea where it comes from. It's just always there. And usually I'm drowning it out or trying to respond to it, drowning it out with distractions or trying to respond to it with things that won't actually quench it. So Sehnsucht is this longing for the life of the soul to be fully unleashed. And Sigmund Freud took it in the direction of psychology and actually stopped and said, you know what? The closest thing that I can do in pinpointing what this amounts to is it's something like taking a long walk in the forest with my father as a child. That brings up some longing, some evocative notion. Of course, it's a poetic idea, but that captures the best that he could do. He was actually very confused by it, but he acknowledged that this is there in the heart of every living being, every human being, at least. And C.S. Lewis took it in another direction. Of course, C.S. Lewis was a spiritualist, Sigmund Freud was not. So C.S. Lewis had a vocabulary for this that Freud was not really comfortable with. And he expressed it as the longing of the soul to be itself and to be in divine relationship. So Carl Jung also spoke about this from both a psychological standpoint and a spiritual standpoint. He sort of bridged the gap very nicely. And I mean, C.S. Lewis was profoundly psychological as well. But Jung was really famous for his psychological insights. And he talked about this archetypical ecstasy that we're all searching for. And we try to pursue it in so many different ways. It's like I go to alcohol, I go to spirits for my seeking of spirit. Alcohol is called spirits, right? And it's not a coincidence, he would say. I'm seeking this high because my soul not only craves it, but my soul requires it. I will never be peaceful. I will never be content. I will never be satiated until I actually awaken the soul. Till then, I'll always be searching for something that will hopefully fill the void, but never can. So seeking the self is in many ways not optional. Your own soul will hunt you down. Your own soul will chase you to the ends of the earth.
Yeah. Beautiful. You shared, and we spoke about the ego not liking to do the real work on the ego because it's obviously a threat to its existence. And this might be double that in terms of intensity. The ego does not like us to work on our souls either, because it's such a threat to everything that it wants and needs from us in order to continue its existence as it is.
That's so well put. Absolutely. And also we crave acceptance in a world that is not soul-centered. It's a world that makes the soul a veritable myth.
Yeah. To me, that's been one of the most helpful things. And I'm not, as I say this, I'm thinking that maybe I manipulated my ego in order to work on the soul. But there's some truth there around like putting myself in situations and around people and in environments where it was not only socially acceptable, but it was highly encouraged, that kind of soul work. And maybe that was kind of the appetizer my ego needed, some validation for that kind of stuff in order to get excited about soul work in the first place. And then there were deeper and deeper glimpses of what that actually meant. And not that I have ever experienced that full ecstasy, but I've certainly gotten glimpses of it. And that's such a necessary part of the journey to have further motivation to go deeper.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And it's a very wise thing that you've done and which you're offering to everybody, which is to engage the ego in the work of the soul. So we have to start from where we're at, which is identified with the ego, and dovetail our ego in the service of the real self. So getting validation for things that are healthier is a step in the right direction. And we need that support. We talk about Sangha, the principle of Sangha all the time. I mean, there's nothing more critical than connection to like-minded people who are working on themselves in this vein. That is Sangha, or association. We require that. And to be validated for the good that we're doing in working on our egos and investing in the self, that's powerful, that's necessary. There's almost no other way to do it. And as we go more and more, we become more identified with the self, less identified with the ego. And the validation that comes is more for the self and less for the ego.
Yeah. And as we ourselves think about dishing out validation, we want to do that for other people's selves rather than their egos. And that's also a way that we can uplift others and help to create those environments, which will be also beneficial for our own self and soul work.
Yes.
So So it's pretty clear that most people come to coaching or self-work in general more focused on working on their egos rather than their souls. But you shared a very striking example in the piece of the other way around. You were a monk in a monastery for a number of years, and you shared an example of some of your fellow monks who were working on their souls, but not necessarily working on their egos and the more psychological sides of themselves. So could you share a little bit more about that and what happens when that's the case?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was a really formative experience for me, observing my fellow monks in the 5 years that I was a monk myself, and seeing how it's so easy for somebody who is adopting a spiritual paradigm to neglect the where I'm at piece, and to not recognize how my ego is running the show. And I really, really need to do this work on the ego. Otherwise, my work on the soul is just a show. It's really just like, it's in name only. And the greatest disservice to the self is doing things out of ego in the name of the self. And it's the greatest disservice to others, because now you create a hall of mirrors. And this is why people are so burnt out by spirituality, and especially by the term religion, because you have tons of people that are dressing up their egos in worship of God and ideas about a soul. And it's so painful, and so much destruction has been done. A terrible, terrible destruction. So now you make it really impossible for people to come to a spiritual path, to come to work on the real self. I am one casualty of that. I'm very, very grateful that somehow I've been able to recover from that. But I looked around me and I thought, wow, spirituality is about the least attractive thing I can think of, because of my experience of it, because of what I had observed of spiritualists that were especially leaders, but even just people around me. It was like, it wasn't deep. It wasn't wise. It wasn't smart. It made me feel like, oh, this is just wishful thinking. And you are needing faith as a crutch. And you're just speaking because you don't have an intellectual rigor to support what you're saying. So you're just kind of making yourself feel better and trying to proselytize others. It's so unattractive. And I couldn't get with anything of a spiritual self. So in our monastery, that was not the case, thankfully. We had really exceptional souls. And still, there was a temptation for many to neglect the ego work because it feels beneath me. It feels like, hey, I've gotten to the real self. I haven't really gotten to the real self, but I'm telling myself I'm doing all the work to get to the real self. And I don't need this worldly psychological mumbo jumbo. Just as there are people who are like, I don't need this spiritual hocus pocus mumbo jumbo. The spiritualists are saying, I don't need this like petty worldly stuff. And there, if you're self-realized, in other words, if you're completely identified with the real self and you have no more ego, okay, you may not need, but usually you're interested anyway, especially to help others. There's no feeling of this is beneath me. So it's a red flag when we're feeling like, oh yeah, I won't do this stuff because I'm beyond that, I'm above that. And I saw a lot of that led to pain and frustration, because now I have human urges, human needs even, that I'm neglecting because I'm trying to transcend. by hitting a magic transcend button that doesn't exist. And I'm expecting and often projecting that I'm more spiritually advanced or more in touch with the real self than I actually am. And this leads to all kinds of problems, a lot of suffering. And it affected me deeply. The suffering that I experienced being on the receiving end, and also placing my faith in people projecting things beyond where they were, was crazy. And the suffering that I felt out of empathy for my brothers, who I love, always. They are always my brothers. I can never, ever remove that bond that goes beyond words. So to feel their suffering from having neglected themselves, it was too much. And it became very clear we cannot take any shortcuts. We have to work on both sides of ourselves. We have to work on the ego and the self, not one, not the other.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story and your experiences in the monastery. And I just want to echo exactly what you just said and why the title of this piece is such a critical title. The two sides of working on yourself. We have to work on both. And it's also not just religious or monastic people that experience this impulse to just work on the spiritual and bypass the work on the ego, because I know I've felt it myself. I was having a conversation with somebody I work with recently he works at a tech company. He's a hard driving person. And we've been doing a lot of work on the ego. And yet there's a big part of him that like just wants to move, not to become a monk, but to like go study at a monastery or just like be in meditation all day long.
Mm-hmm.
And what we realized by unpacking this is that the ego work has just become uncomfortable. And there's this fantasy that, I'll just be happy and calm and cool and all the stuff that I want when I can just leave all of that work behind. So I don't have to deal with it and just go meditate or just like chill out and be Zen all day long. But it's so clear that the ego would just show up again, and that would actually not solve the problem at all.
That's it. And that's what we're talking about in this piece as spiritual bypass, right? You alluded to the bypass. It's this sense that I don't have to deal with where I'm at. I can go to the goal, focus on the goal, and live in that space, and life is good.
Yeah. Okay. So assuming we are doing at least some ego work and continuing to peel the layers there, what are some practices that you have found helpful to do some meaningful soul work?
Yeah. For me, it's like designing a meal. It has to have different components to it for it to provide maximum nutritional value and taste and satisfaction. So the core, the entree, if you will, would be mantra meditation. So I have a mantra meditation practice where I focus on sacred sound that is specifically geared to awaken the self. And there's nothing I know to be more effective, more powerful than that. And what my teachers have offered us and what is really foundational in our work on the self, it's all based on this mantra meditation. Now, to support that, there are many other things, foremost of which would be reading of sacred texts. So getting wisdom, getting philosophical understanding, building our rigor in understanding what the self is and how to live in alignment with it, and learning from the great souls who have done so. So reading sacred texts, listening to lectures from realized souls, that's absolutely essential. And there's a feedback loop between those two. When I read, when I hear, it makes me really enlivened and eagerly awaiting my meditation practice. And when I do my meditation practice, I want more fuel for that. So I want to go back and read, and I'm really dying to do that. So those are the two biggest pieces. But then there's prayer. There are different offerings and services that we can do. It's adopting a spiritual vision that everyone is a soul. And of course, by doing mantra meditation and reading and hearing, that vision will become more and more natural, and will internalize the teachings of those who have that vision. So these things go hand in hand. But there's so much that can be said about every one of these and so much more. I will pause on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just love your excitement and energy around these kinds of conversations, because it's just so clear how passionate you are about each of these practices and how much benefit they have offered to you. And then as you've offered them out through your teachings, how the community has been affected as a result of that. So
it's very sweet.
I'll
Thank
call
you.
that out. And also share my own experience with the entree with mantra meditation. It's just amazing to be able to find that place of quiet, and then to create sacred sounds with your own voice, with my own voice when I'm doing it, and to get the feedback and the benefit and the vibration of those sounds. And what that does, it just like it shifts something. I guess as we're having this exact conversation, what it's doing is it's getting me in touch with my real self. And that's quite a feeling. It's not so easy to describe, but it's quite a feeling, and it's on the path towards ecstasy.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it is immediate change in consciousness, immediate. And it is long-term transformation into the real self. It is a cumulative effect. When we have a regular, staunch practice, there's just nothing better. There's absolutely nothing better. So that regular, staunch practice, and the more we build it up, the stronger our investment in the self is. I didn't start with doing 2+ hours of mantra meditation a day. Now I do quite a bit. I have a lot. There's a lot that I invest in myself through these practices, but I didn't start that way. So building our spiritual strength step by step is key. And the cumulative impact on us is immeasurable. I mean, you cannot fathom it.
Wonderful. So as we start to bring this conversation to a close, just to recap the steps for working on the ego, and then some of the practices for the self. So for the ego, step 1, awareness, and to call yourself out. 2, don't play into it the best you can. 3, when you inevitably do play into it, take responsibility for it. Make sure you're going back to the people who affected and trying to have a conversation, apologizing if that feels natural and there's an ability to do that. And then step 4 is to seek help. Coaching is really helpful, mentorship, friends and others who might be able to guide us along the path. And so that's working on one side of ourselves, the ego, and then the other side, the soul, is, as you say, and I love this articulation in the piece, the ego is the outside in approach, and the soul work is the inside out approach. So the inside out approach being practices like mantra meditation and prayer and reading sacred texts, listening to lectures, and having that be a real self-fulfilling prophecy is one practice. builds on the next, and it also inspires us to do the others.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I just like to offer this metaphor, as I did in the closing of the piece, of a garden. And this is given in wisdom texts, that the real self requires cultivation like a garden. And so you have to water it with spiritual practice. And again, even Don Riso and Russ Hudson at the Enneagram Institute would say that you can only go so far without a spiritual practice. Your ego will always run you until you get there. So watering that garden with spiritual practice, and then at the same time, uprooting the weeds. That's peeling the layers of the ego, uprooting the weeds. We have to weed the garden, otherwise, it will choke the self. So, that metaphor is super helpful, that we want to call ourselves to become expert gardeners in tending to the real self.
Amazing. Let's go pull some weeds and water our gardens. Well, thank you, Hari, for sharing this piece, for writing this piece, for taking your inspiration and that new aha moment that you felt, and for translating it into words that you've shared with our community, and then for our conversation today as you've further articulated something which I know is so core to you, to our work, and to what you want to offer to the world.
Deeply appreciate that, Michael. It's so wonderful to have this time with you and to be given the chance to serve everyone who is listening. Really, it means the world to me. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening.